Looks like we are recording and all right, I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome back from your stretch or short coffee break. So for the last hour here that we have in this workshop, I'm going to talk primarily about ESPEI. So as mentioned a couple times so far today, ESPEI is our tool for using PyCalFed and combining the thermodynamic data to fit thermodynamic databases. Um, and so as we discussed earlier, the whole idea in CalFed here is that we're fitting these Gibbs energies of T, P, and composition through these different contributions. And we're doing that by combining these thermodynamic data, so the Gibbs energies and their derivatives, and the phase boundary and phase equilibrium data. We use those to model these Gibbs energy functions and then go use them for doing our calculations, as Richard just illustrated. A lot of the things you can do um, with the CalFed method, but even then, just a small slice of all the possibilities. And so we build up these databases, again, starting from pure elements up through binary, ternary, and then up to multi-component systems. And so I just want to motivate a little bit why we need ESPEI or why we need a new tool for thermodynamic database development. So here on this slide, I've compared the same system, so iron, nickel, titanium in two different databases. So one of them is in a commercial database, and the other one is in a database based on the literature from a little over 10 years ago now. And so you can see these two databases have some discrepancies where, especially in the concentrated region, so where we have roughly equal amounts of iron, nickel, and titanium, we see that there's the most differences compared to the commercial database. And the one on the right from the literature is assessed over the entire system. And so if you're using the one on the left, you might not realize that in these areas where you have roughly equal amounts of iron and nickel and titanium, that your the predictions you make would be incorrect using the commercial database. And unless you know the systems or know the literature very well, you might not realize that. But additionally, here's a different system. So chrome, titanium, vanadium. We can see in this assessment here at this isothermal section, there's several data plotted based on some experiments. And if we focus on this phase boundary here, so this is the phase boundary connecting the single phase BCC region to the chrome 2 titanium region. The experiments here as stars are all single phase BCC, and then the dashed circles are all two phase. And so what this data is telling you is that we know that this phase boundary here that delineates the 1 and 2 phase region is going to be somewhere between these stars and circles. But the data we have here doesn't tell you exactly where. And so the people who modeled this system um, with the calculated phase diagram shown chose to model the phase boundary as roughly in between them. And again, if you were to calculate the phase diagram of the system without seeing the data, you might not realize that there's this huge range of compositional uncertainty in where this phase boundary actually is. And you can even see, looking at the data, that these stars here should be single phase, but this database is telling you that it's two phase. And so one of the limitations of existing databases as they're out there is that they're all point estimates of a model at a certain time. And again, like I said, calculating and making predictions using this database won't necessarily tell you details like how much uncertainty there is of this phase boundary. And so this is a problem we want to solve. But again, as discussed earlier, one of the challenges in building these CalFed databases is that we build them up from the unaries to binaries, ternaries, and in some cases, multi-component interactions that we need to model. And so what this is illustrating here is that if we were to change element C we would have to go and change all of the C-containing binaries and update those, and all of the C-containing ternaries. And so there's a large explosion, and making changes to the foundation of this inverse pyramid can have big consequences, and how much work there is to do to propagate those changes through. And again, uh, Zikwe touched through this figure earlier, but I just want to emphasize and drive home that there's a lot of efforts just to update an individual system that's circled here on the left, with going through all the data, translating them, and so on, and iterating on your model, um, and often not publishing all these results. So anyone who wants to do this has to do all of these steps all over again. And so one of the initial solutions that Professor Liu had for this problem is to try to introduce ESPEI. This work was back in 2010. And so this initial prototype for ESPEI was based on SQL, and used thermocalc as the thermodynamic engine for doing the calculations in order to predict the parameters. And so compared to now, the ability to use thermocalc to do these calculations was definitely not as powerful as it is today with stuff like TC Python. And so you can appreciate some of the difficulty maybe if you're an old thermocalc user, about how difficult this was to do. And so since then, as we've just talked about through the last hour or two, is we've developed PyCalFed. So what PyCalFed will let you do is take your database and do all of the forward simulations of the properties that we talked about, and all of the Gibbs energies, and minimize and be able to plot phase diagrams and predict all the phase relationships that a thermodynamic database would give you. And since then, we've developed ESPEI, which now uses PyCalFed as the underlying thermodynamic engine. And so what ESPEI does in a nutshell is basically these three things. So first, you can rapidly generate models, so thermodynamic CalFed models from single phase data. And then you can optimize those models using a Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation, and updating all of your initial parameters to all of the thermodynamic data available. And then in the process, you can do some uncertainty quantification. And so today we're going to talk about all of these parts. And so first, I want to talk a little bit about model generation from single phase data. So I just have one slide here on the theory about how this works. So what we do, as I mentioned, is we take all of the single phase thermochemical data. So in particular, this all comes from, or all can come from, first principles calculations. So everything that you guys talked about yesterday with PyIron, so this is where that is used in ESPEI, is in this parameter selection step. So we take these Gibbs energy functions for individual phases as a function of temperature, pressure, and the internal degrees of freedom. And you can combine these with experiments, but we really think that first principles is the way to go here. And so we then fit those to those Gibbs energies that are calculated to standard type form of Gibbs energy polynomials that you'll see throughout the CalFed literature. And then we need to choose how many of these coefficients, so how many of these A, B, C, Dn terms we want to fit, and so how we will expand our Gibbs energy as a function of temperature. And so as most of us intuitively know, as we increase the number of parameters that we include in our model, we'll get better and better fits. And so that's illustrated here on the raw model score in this figure, where we're plotting the score, which is the goodness of fit, versus the complexity, which is the number of parameters. And so again, intuitively, we can understand that increasing the model complexity or the number of parameters can arbitrarily increase your model score until you are perfectly fitting the data. But in reality, we know that often leads to overfitting, especially in the world of CalFed, where we have limited ability to do experiments. And so we often want to find some trade-off between how complex our model is and the goodness of fit. And so the way that we do that in ESPEI is we use this corrected Akiki information criterion. which is given by this expression here. So basically, we're calculating the likelihood for a particular set of parameters that are optimal. And so the likelihood is this model score. And then we are penalizing that model score by these two terms here. And so there's an initial penalty for increasing the number of parameters. So again, this model complexity K. And so these first two terms here are just the Kiki information criterion. And then the additional corrected version we use is just this additional term here, where there's an additional penalty now for having a low number of data points, because as I mentioned, and as many of us know, we cannot collect infinitely many experiments, although we can with calculations. And so this n term takes that into account. Okay, and so this is basically all of the single phase parameter generation fitting from the theory side. And so now I'll give a short demo on how this works in our Jupyter notebooks. Okay, and so yeah, if you're in your in the Jupyter Hub and from the workshop, everything we'll be doing here is an ESPEI. So if we open up this folder, the first place we're going to start is this ESPEI parameter selection notebook. And so if you open that, we can see everything that you need to run it is here. So much like the PyCalcide ones, you can just run this as is without any changes. So I'll talk a little bit about what you actually need to run ESPEI. And again, there's these two modes of operation that we have. We have this parameter selection or parameter generation, I might also say. And then we have the Markov chain Monte Carlo. And so the goal, as I mentioned, of the parameter selection is to take single phase data and then produce a initial TDB estimate fitting one phase at a time, and producing a database. And so to start these assessments in ESPEI, you'll need three things. So you'll need a JSON formatted file that describes the phases that we want to assess and their models. You'll need a directory that contains all of our ESPEI datasets, and so instructions on how to format them are here, and I'll talk a little bit more below with some examples. And then you'll need a YAML file that will tell ESPEI what settings to run with and allows you to tune hyperparameters and tells where these files are, for example. And again, we'll talk all about that in a moment. And so the first thing that you need, as I mentioned, is you need this JSON file that describes the phases. And so if you're not familiar with JSON, it looks like this. So this is exactly the one that we'll use here. And it's just a mapping of keys. So components is a key to values. It's basically a dictionary that you can store on disk in plain text, if you're familiar with Python dictionaries. And so for any assessment, you need to define the components. So in this case, today we're going to look at chrome nickel in these examples just because it's simple. And so this was a binary, of course. But I should mention that ESPEI, you can do arbitrarily sized multi-component systems in both the parameter generation and the Markov chain Monte Carlo fitting. So there's no limitations in the software for what you can do. You're really limited by the data that you have and the computational time for the Markov chain Monte Carlo simulations. Okay, so you have the components, and then you have a dictionary of phases where you're mapping a phase name to the sublattice model that you'll use. So in this case, just to keep things as simple as possible, we have a single sublattice for all of these phases, so liquid, FCC, and BCC. And then we've defined only chrome and nickel in those phases. And then we also define the sublattice site ratios. And so these are the stoichiometric coefficients for the sublattices. And so this will be a list that corresponds to an integer number of site ratios that correspond to the number of sublattices you have. So in each of these cases, we only have one sublattice. So we only have to provide one stoichiometric ratio. And so we're just choosing one for all these. And then the other thing you'll notice is these aliases. And so what these are is alternate names for these phases. And in particular, one of the phase name or the list of aliases needs to match the unary reference state that you will use. And so what I mean by that is ESPEI by default will give you a set of unaries. So it gives you the latest SGTE unary database to start with, if you're familiar with that. And the reason for that is just that's what the community has seemed to gravitate to keep all the databases compatible with each other. And so we provide that for free, if you will. But you can also bring your own unaries or even use ESPEI to fit unary functions if you want, and that's all up to you. But in this case, we're going to fit the SGTE ones. Okay, so that's your phase JSON file. So that's going to define what we're fitting. And so, of course, the other thing that we need is the data that we will fit to. And so we categorize sort of three different types of data that you can express in the and use in ESPEI. So the ones that we support right now are non-equilibrium thermochemical data. And so this is where you know the internal degrees of freedom. And so this is, again, why DFT is so powerful, because you can control exactly the internal degrees of freedom and calculate the Gibbs energy as you saw with the pi iron part of the workshop yesterday. And so in this case, the non-equilibrium thermochemical data doesn't seem that different from equilibrium, because for all of our phases we have one sublattice, and so the internal degrees of freedom map one-to-one onto the compositions. But you can imagine if you have a more complex phase that's maybe a stoichiometric compound that has some solubility, you might model that with multiple sublattices. And so if you were to perform some experiment, you might know the overall composition, but you wouldn't know the internal degrees of freedom of that phase, so the site fractions, unless you measured them using some experimental technique. And so for the parameter selection, this non-equilibrium thermochemical data is really the core driver of being able to generate these parameters, because again, we know the internal degrees of freedom. And so one example for non-equilibrium thermochemical data for the system is here. And so we describe the components that are found in this data set, the phases that are found, and then we have the solver key that contains all of the internal degrees of freedom. And so again, the sublattice site ratios is going to look exactly the same as in our phase models file. So this is just for consistency. And then you'll see the sublattice configurations here. And so for each of these, you'll see we have 4 different entries for chrome nickel. And so each one of these entries is one particular set of internal degrees of freedoms. So we have the species chrome and nickel, and then those are going to correspond to the sublattice occupancies, which are the internal degrees of freedom. So in this first case here, we have a composition or a site fraction of 0.1 of chrome and 0.9 of nickel. And then for the second one here, we again have 0.1 of chrome and 0.9 of nickel. And so you'll see that they're repeated. And so all that's saying is that we have 2 different sources or 2 different measurements, for example, of this, this particular composition. And so, yeah, and so on, you can see how that repeats. And so we have 4 measurements here, and those correspond with 4 values of type HM form. And so the idea here is that these correspond not exactly, but very closely to PyCalFed's output key that Richard just talked about. And so you can do HM form or HM mix. And then if you have equilibrium thermochemical data, you can use HMR and use your own reference state. And so you'll see that these values, there's 3 brackets. And so this is actually a 3-dimensional array. And so the reason that is because you can also supply a grid of pressures and temperatures. So if you combine a grid of pressure, temperature, and compositions, you can have 3 dimensions of values. And so the shape of values is going to be The outer dimension will be for pressure, the middle dimension temperature, and the innermost dimension will correspond to the compositions. So in this case, we have 1 pressure, 1 temperature, and 4 compositions. And so our values is a 1 by 1 by 4 array. And so again, thinking back to pi iron yesterday, if you have a grid of temperatures and compositions, maybe at atmospheric pressure, you could have 10 temperatures and 10 compositions and contain all that in one file for one phase, which is really convenient, again, because we can easily calculate these properties on regular grids if we're using atomistic methods. Okay, so that's non-equilibrium thermochemical data, and so that's the primary thing that we're using, and the only thing that we're using for this parameter selection step. But just while we're talking about data sets, I also want to touch on how you describe phase boundary data, since our minds are primed to think about data sets right now. So these are also JSON files where we have the component specified, and then all of the phases that participate in the equilibria that we want to describe here. And so in this case, we also can have a grid of temperatures and pressures. So you see in this case, we have 5 different temperatures. And then the output is ZPF. Oops. So the output for phase boundary data is ZPF, so standing for zero phase fraction. And so what all these values are is it describes what phase it is, and then you have a list of independent components. So again, this is just a binary, so there's only one independent component. But if you had a ternary, then this would be a list of two components, or however many components you have. So if you have an n component system, then you have n-1 independent components that you need to specify here. And then these compositions correspond to the components. So if you have 4 components, 4 independent components here, then you would have 4 independent compositions for those components as well. And so what I've done is each line here, I've just sort of visually split up into 1 equilibria. And so you can see there's 5 temperatures and 1 pressure. And so there will be 5 individual equilibria that we are trying to describe here in this data set. And so you're going to see that in this first one, we have FCC and the composition of chromium where FCC becomes stable in this 2-phase region is at 38.6%. And then we're saying for nickel, for the BCC phase, so in this 2-phase equilibrium, we're using null here. And so what that indicates is that for whatever reason, the way this experiment was conducted or how the data was collected, we don't know what the composition is. And so having these nulls here is not a problem. ESPEI can handle that. And this is actually very common for binary systems because you can imagine that if you isothermally let a sample at 1073 Kelvin reach equilibrium, and then you quench it, you might only measure the composition of chrome in the FCC phase. Or maybe you make an alloy at this composition and you heat it up in your DSC, and then you see that there's a phase transformation from FCC only to the 2-phase region, and it happens at this temperature. And so you know in that case the composition of the FCC phase at that transition, but you don't know what the other side of that tie line is. And so that's what the null is for. And so like I said, that's totally normal and expected. Okay, that's all I'll talk about for data sets. And then the last thing you need, like I said, 3 things, is you'll need a YAML file that describes, that tells ESPEI what to do. And so this is like the simplest one that you can come up with for parameter generation. And so you have to tell ESPEI what the file name is of your phase models. And so we say phases.json. And so you can see that in our directory here, where we have the same information as I showed you above. And then we have a folder of input data. And so that's points to, again, a directory that just contains all of these JSON files for all the phases that will fit today. And then we have this output, so you can control the verbosity, so how much information ESPEI will give you as you're using it, and then the output DB, which is the name of the output database that we will create. And so to actually run the parameter generation, all you have to do is add this generate parameters key here. So these YAML files I didn't mention are also just key value mappings. They're just a little more human readable than the JSON, which is why we use the YAML. And so the only two required options for parameter generation is the excess model. So right now we only support fitting linear excess models, and then the reference state. So as I mentioned, we provide the SGTE reference state for the unaries, and so we call it SGTE 91 for historical reasons because that's when the paper came out, but we use the most updated SGTE unary 5 database. So if you're familiar with that and that makes sense to you, that's what's happening. If you're not familiar with that, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so, and as I mentioned above, you can bring your own reference state, and so that's why we have this key here. So you can maybe create a unary for Chrome if you like, and then you could say Bocklund 93 or whatever you want to call it. And there's ways that you can tell ESPEI where to find those. And so we have examples about that on the documentation. I didn't mention it explicitly, but ESPEI also has documentation at espei.org. And so you'll see the links littered throughout these presentations. But we have, again, all this information here and available for you. And so there's lots more than just what we'll talk about today, and a little bit different examples and so on. But for the sake of time, I want to go ahead and start doing some calculations. And so all we're doing here is we're doing some imports, and then we're going to read. I have these YAML parameters saved to this generate param settings YAML file. And so if we run this cell, it's just reading those into a dictionary, a Python dictionary from the YAML. And so all we have to do is run this run espei function and pass in our dictionary of parameters. And so if we do that, we can see that this takes just a couple seconds to go from all of our data and to fit them. And so the parameter generation is very fast. And so you can see here that we just created our dft.tdb. And so if we open that up, you can see that you have a TDB here that was generated by espei and written by PyCalFed. And so all the parameters that we fit are stored as functions with VV and some arbitrary number. And then those are used below to generate these interaction parameters. And so you can see that for BCC, FCC, and liquid, we've generated these constant coefficients plus a temperature dependent one. And so we can fit arbitrary, we can fit that entire Gibbs energy polynomial and expand up to pretty high orders of temperature terms, but that's not typical for interactions, and so we didn't fit that here. Okay, and so if we plot the phase diagram that we from the database we have, so this run espei wrote that database dft.tdb out to a file, but it also returns that object, so we can just use it directly in our code when we run binplot with PyCalFed. And so we've plotted the database here. So this is our parameter estimation. So remember, we generated this database only using single phase data from experimental literature and from first principles data. But we might want to compare what this phase diagram looks like compared to our data sets. And so espei will allow you to load up data sets from any directory you want, and then you can call binplot and get the axes back. So Richard talked about that during the last session. And then we can pass those axes into this data plot function that espei provides, and we can plot the phase diagram and then plot the phase boundary data on top of it. And so you can see here that the agreement is okay. It's definitely not publication ready yet, but again, I just want to emphasize that in this first fitting that we did here, we're not fitting to this phase boundary data. We're only fitting to the single phase data, and we're just comparing how the fits look from here. And so we can then optimize or look into all the different fittings that espei did. So for example, we can look into how does the BCC interaction for chrome nickel compare to our data? And if we plot these, we can go ahead and look and have these easy API functions that let you compare the fittings that you did to different data. And so I won't run all of these here just for the sake of time. But one thing I do want to talk a little bit about is this feature that we have to nudge ESPEI with your intuition. And so you can see for the liquid phase here that the fitting function looks very symmetric and parabolic. And this data suggests that could definitely be the case. But if we can use ESPEI to search our parameters, or use PyCalFat to search the parameters that we generated, just like Richard showed in the custom model case. And we can see that for the liquid, we actually generate 4 different orders of excess parameters. So we have an L0, a first order, and a second order. Or sorry, we have 3 orders of parameters. And so each of those is fit with a constant term times plus a temperature term. So we have 3 different liquid interaction parameters. But looking back at this, we think that maybe only one L0 parameter might be required, and not this L1 and L2. So what we can do is we can tell ESPEI, we can nudge it and say that we want to penalize having more parameters. So again, thinking back to that Akiki information criterion, we want to further penalize having more parameters versus our model score. And so what you can do is you can use this AICC penalty factor to nudge the Akiki information criterion even further, to be able to say, I want more parameters here or fewer based on my intuition or other background knowledge. So in this case, what we're doing is for the liquid, we're saying that we're going to add this penalty factor of 10 to all enthalpy and entropy data. And then if we do that same fitting again, using this YAML file here, we can do the same fitting. So again, just take a couple seconds and create this new database. And then if we look and search the parameters again, I missed an import. Yep. Okay. If we look at do the same parameter search again, so looking for liquid excess parameters, we can see that we only get 1 parameter. And then if we plot up that how that parameter looks compared to our data, we can see that just visually it looks almost identical to our previous one. And we can verify the phase diagram before and after applying that AICC penalty factor and see that they look almost identical. So what that's saying is our energy that we fit is almost exactly the same, but we just did it with fewer parameters, which is good. And so that's all I want to say about parameter generation for now. And then we have some challenges here, but just for the interest of time, I want to keep moving. Does anyone have any questions here before we start talking a little bit more about the MCMC?
Hey, Brandon.
Hello?
Better, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, so without a penalty, like the first term when you auto-generated, this is always give you like 3 or 4 or 5 interaction parameter. This is depend on the data that you have.
Yeah, it will depend on the data. So basically all it's doing is it's trying to optimize this AICC score. And so maybe for this liquid, we had a lot of data. And so what we were saying is that we could be very confident with this N here is probably what's happening is we were being very confident in saying that we're pretty certain that we can add more parameters here based on the number of data points that we have. But I think some of it is the scatter here was kind of lowering our goodness of fit for having fewer parameters. Yeah, just the way that this calculated out 3 parameters was better than just 1 parameter.
Okay.
And so this AICC penalty factor will basically take these 2 terms and increase or decrease them depending on whether your AICC penalty factor is greater than or less than 1.
Okay.
Okay. So if there are no other questions, I want to talk a little bit about the Monte Carlo fitting. Okay. So yeah, like I mentioned, this is the what I just showed you was the parameter generation. So there again, we're fitting only the single phase data. But of course, in CalFed modeling, if you have a lot of experience and are familiar with it, we want to be able to fit and optimize our models to all kinds of data, but especially the phase boundary data. That's one of the core, first order metrics of how good your CalFed model is at reproducing experiments is how the phase diagram looks. And so we do all of this with Markov chain Monte Carlo. And so for those of you unfamiliar, I want to take a little bit of time here and have a couple slides to give you some intuition about the fundamentals and what's happening here. So Markov chain Monte Carlo is a method of Bayesian parameter estimation. And so what we're looking at here is Bayes' theorem. And so our goal of MCMC is to reproduce this posterior probability distribution of the parameters parameters theta conditioned on some data D. And so the way that we compute this posterior distribution for our parameters is we compute the likelihood, so the probability of observing some data given a set of parameters, and then multiply that by our prior, which is the probability distribution associated with all of our parameter values that is user input usually, and then we have this data D, which is the probability of observing all of your data. And so graphically, what this looks like um, is as follows. So in this system, we have a 2-parameter system, theta 1 and theta 2, and we have these contour lines on the right, and then we've plotted the surface on the left. And so what this is our prior. So what we're saying here is that we think that the mean for theta 1 and theta 2 are both around 0.5, but they're not necessarily correlated with each other, and we're not very informative about what we think the actual value of theta 1 and theta 2 are. And so that's our prior for this model. And then, so now we can imagine that we've observed some data, so again, D, and we're evaluating what the probability of observing that data D is, given all the combinations of parameter values in this parameter space. So all values, in this case, between 0 and 1 of theta 1 and theta 2. And so if we compute the likelihood or the probabilities, we get this probability distribution here. And so again, using our Bayes theorem here, we can compute the posterior just by multiplying these together. And so you can see that the posterior is heavily informed by the likelihood, but it's a little bit smoothed out in a sense because of our prior. And so in practice, what you'll notice here, even in this example, is that we didn't actually include this probability of the data. And so this is actually really difficult to determine in practice. And so typically Bayes' theorem is written as a proportionality between the posterior and the likelihood times the prior. And the way that we get around this numerically, because another challenge is that it's difficult to sample all of this parameter space, especially in high dimensions, is that we use Markov chain Monte Carlo. And so that's where this MCMC comes from. And so the idea with MCMC is that we're creating a Markov chain. So that's just a sequence of values that are all independent. So it's independent samples of parameters, in this case on the right, theta 1 and theta 2. And then we're choosing the parameters that we want to sample and possibly add to the Markov chain by Monte Carlo. And so that's the core principle and of why this Markov chain Monte Carlo works is that the more times a particular parameter value appears in the Markov chain, the number of appearances is proportional to the probability. And so if we think about our case here on the right, so theta 1 has high probability around values of theta 1 of 0.7. And so theta 1 equal to 0.7 is going to show up more times in the Markov chain than having a theta 1 of 0.4. which is much less likely compared to 0.7. And so that's the idea of MCMC. But one challenge with vanilla Markov chain Monte Carlo, if you're used to that from another domain or maybe in your own work, is that in CalFAD we would expect parameters to be highly correlated. And the reason for that is that we have these excess terms L of order V, and we might expand those in temperature with, again, this A plus BT, for example. And so if we just have a point energy, you can imagine in your mind that there's an infinite number of A plus B T coefficients that can give you the exact same energy. And so we would expect to see lots of correlations between different parameters, so parameter A and a parameter B in CalFED. And so this on the left is a real example of these different CalFED parameters in an actual model. And so what this is telling you is along the diagonal here are the probability distributions for each parameter. And so here is the probability distribution or the histogram of values for A0, B0, A1, B1, and so on. And then under the diagonal are the covariances between them. And so this block here is the covariance or the correlation between B0 and A0. And so we can see that they're very tightly correlated. And again, this goes back to this this fact that there's an infinite number of solutions if you just have one energy sample. But we can see in a way that sort of matches our intuition as we go to higher order parameters. So we're up into this A2, B2. So excess parameters of order 2, they have a lot weaker correlations between each other because these energies are a lot less sensitive for these higher order parameters. And so that's a challenge we have, is that these are highly correlated. And so the way that we solve this problem is in ESPEI is that we have these two parameters, this example system here, and we use an ensemble Markov chain Monte Carlo method that can handle these correlations. And so the idea is that if this is the target distribution here, these contour lines, and we have a sample, or we're starting from this blue point, and we want to propose the next sample, we might propose something out here or something here, but these are all going to be in very low probability space. And what we want to do, and what this ensemble MCMC method will do, is allow you to make a proposal and then scale that proposal to the state of a bunch of chains, so a bunch of samples that you've already taken. And that allows us to make a proposal that's scaled in the target distribution, as long as we have the target distribution well sampled. And so the property of these samplers is called affine invariance. So it's invariant to some affine transformation, so some scaling or translation. Okay, and so this is an example of some prior work. So if you start from this single phase parameter generation example that we just did for chrome nickel, and so it's shown here for copper magnesium, and then you apply this Markov chain Monte Carlo. And so what that looks like is that as you go through these iterations, each line on this plot is one chain. And like I said, in the ensemble method, we have many chains. So you'll have this burn-in phase where we've plotted the negative log likelihood here. And so the log likelihood will increase. Again, the negative log likelihood is decreasing. And then we have this, what we call burn-in phase, or what people usually call the burn-in phase, where we're reaching and approaching the target posterior distribution. And then we have this UQ phase, so we're doing the uncertainty quantification. And so we're sampling whatever the target posterior distribution is. And so if we do this for copper magnesium in this case, we can see that we get very good agreement from our best sample of that UQ phase here. And so now I want to show how this works again on our chrome nickel system. Okay. And we have about 15 minutes left, so I'll try and I'll try and move through this relatively quickly, but also still have it be satisfying. Um, so the key difference here is that instead of having this parameter generation key in your YAML file, so again, telling ESPEI what to run, the bare minimum for MCMC, all you have to do is include the key here. The bare minimum is that you need an input database, and so you can input any TDB that you have. All you have to do is name the variables that you want to fit with that VV and some form, and then you need to specify the number of iterations. But there's lots of options. Uh, again, in the documentation that's linked here, there's lots of options that you can control, hyperparameters and other things to make your calculations go faster. So like one example is we use this approximate equilibrium here, which make the calculations go significantly faster at the cost of a little bit of accuracy in theory, but in practice, it's really the inaccuracy is smaller than the uncertainty in a lot of cases. Okay, so if we run this and start the Markov chain Monte Carlo, what I'm going to do is run this file here. So if you look at our MCC settings.yaml, it will look exactly like this. And so we're not running in parallel here on this cloud resource, but if you're running on your own laptop, or if you're running on a supercomputer, if you want, you can run ESPEI in parallel. And so, I'm running these 3 iterations here. And so for the settings above, it's going to take about 3 minutes here. And I won't talk in too much detail about all the output here, but there's lots of outputs, verbosity settings that you can have. And so this is an intermediate one. So the verbosity is 2. So it's a little more verbose than what we did with the parameter selection. And so you're able to see for each proposal. So you make a proposal, and then you can see what the likelihood and log probability are for those. And you can see how that breaks down into the different types of data contributions. And so if we run these 3 iterations here, what we need to do, because we're using ensemble Markov chain Monte Carlo, we need to, for every iteration, go through all of the chains. And so by default, you have 2 times the number of chains, or 2 times the number of parameters in chains. And so in this system, if we scroll up to the output, it's going to tell you that we have somewhere. Oh yeah, we're fitting 12 degrees of freedom. So those are 12 parameters that we're trying to fit. So 12 coefficients. And then we're fitting those with 2 chains per parameter, which is the default. And so it says that right here. So that gives us a total of 24 chains. So we have to evaluate the likelihood and 24 different proposals to do 1 iteration. And so to run this takes on this machine like 3 minutes, I think, to roughly to do these 3 iterations. And so that's kind of the ballpark. So at the end, what you get back, I didn't show that, is for Markov chain Monte Carlo, you get back both the database and this sampler object. So what that means and what we can do with that is the sampler object gives you the chain, which we call the trace. So it gives you all of the chains and all of the iterations back as an array. So in this case, the array shape is 24, the number of chains, by 3, the number of iterations, by 12, the number of parameters. So every single value of the parameters that we accepted to the Markov chain is going to be contained here in this trace. And so this is where you can see all the proposed parameters. And then the log probabilities are for each set of parameters, we have the log probability calculated. And so you can see that it's again the same number of chains and iterations, but we don't have this extra parameters dimension here because we consider 1 set of parameters and we compute the likelihood for all of those. And so yeah, these are the main outputs of the Markov chain Monte Carlo. And so we can do all the same things again for the interest of time. I won't run them here, but we can load up our data and compare what it looks like just after 3 iterations. So if we compare this phase diagram to the one that we had from our parameter generation. So you can see that the solubility is improved a lot, and the liquidus improved a lot also. And so this is just after 3 iterations. And so I don't have the so typically, like I showed, you're going to have this burn-in phase where your likelihood is increasing as you're approaching the target distribution, and then you have this uncertainty quantification. And so what I have done here is I've used this MCMC full.yaml file and run this on my personal laptop in parallel, and computed this traceFull and logprobfull.mpy files. And so these are arrays that we stored to disk of these trace and log probability. And so, as I said, I've done the same thing, but I've calculated now 2,000 iterations of MCMC. And so we can look and see how the log probability converges. So again, the log probability now is increasing as we go through this burn-in phase over what looks like maybe 100 iterations, and then we're approaching this steady state or near steady state as we explore the probability distribution. And you can see that if we plot this and zoom in a little bit, that we can see how the probability is increasing slightly, but in the scope of things, we're still we're more slowly approaching the true target distribution, but still doing some reasonably effective uncertainty quantification along the way. And we can do lots of things with these now. So again, every line, I forgot to mention, again, every line is one chain. And so you'll see lots of chains here and lots of lines plotted on top of each other, giving us this visualization. And so we can do lots of things with these. So this is a simple visualization that's quite useful, is to look at over all of our iterations, how does the parameter value for this particular parameter. So I just chose arbitrarily the one at index 5 in our trace file. And we can see how that one changes. We can see that initially we took very wide array of values, but then we sort of honed in and started to optimize optimize towards whatever the target distribution is. And one nice thing to see is that you'll see that the chains are kind of clumped as you're optimizing, and then as you get closer to local minima, then the chains will start to spread out and explore the space, which is one really nice property of these ensemble samplers. Okay, and so if we did this for 2,000 iterations, we would get this phase diagram, which has very good agreement. And so these 2,000 iterations on my laptop, I think took about 6 hours on a like 2015 MacBook Pro. And so you can do pretty large systems without needing to go to supercomputing resources. So I fit binaries and ternaries pretty regularly, just on a desktop type machine. So it's very easy to do with ESPEI. Okay. Again, there's some more challenge stuff here that you can do and explore on your own. Again, as Richard mentioned, taking all the work that you did and all these files, and you can download them as an archive. And I want to spend the last few minutes that I have of your time here just showing a little bit about what you can do once you have all the uncertainty quantified. And so, okay. And so, so now I want to talk about again how do we take this quantified uncertainty and then go propagate it to anything you would like to do. And so the basic concept of what we do here is, so we have these parameters in our TDB. So again, this VV0001. And then as I just showed you, we have these a bunch of samples of that VV0001 in our trace. And so what we can do is just plug in these different samples into our TDB using PyCalFad to automate all this. And then we can go and calculate any property that we're interested in, and then basically plot all of them up or stack them all on top of each other and visualize them in whatever way makes the most sense or is convenient. And so we have some examples applied to the copper magnesium system in this Actimat paper. Um, but again, conceptually, all we're doing here is if we try to break it down a little bit, we can look at down to like an individual interaction. So we can look at the mixing enthalpy using our, again, special reference state of having the end members be the reference. And so this is really useful in ESPEI, having that special HM mix reference state, for example. And so in this case, we've plotted the L0, L1, and L2, and they're on different scales, but just to give an idea of what the uncertainty is in the L0 parameter, the scatter of our samples is relatively small compared to the scatter of our samples of the L1 parameters relative to the scale of them. And again, even more so for L2, where we have a much wider range of these values. And again, this is something that should be intuitive if you've done any of this CalFed modeling yourself, in that an L2 parameter is much less sensitive, or the energy is much less sensitive to an L2 parameter than an L0. And so that's why you see these different orders of uncertainty. And then as I showed on the last slide, you can easily just stack these up as well. But again, in this paper, we showed that you can do this for a whole variety of properties. So anything you can compute in PyCalFed, you can use these traces from ESPEI and then plot the uncertainty of them. And so here on the top left, we have examples of the Gibbs energy. So we can see for both the liquid and FCC phases that we have more uncertainty, especially on the magnesium-rich side for FCC compared to liquid, which we have relatively low uncertainty the whole way through. And then we can plot these like metastable phase boundaries, for example, between FCC and liquid. And we can see that on the left here, so on the copper-rich side, where FCC copper is stable, we have a lot more certainty in the phase boundaries than on the magnesium-rich side, where the uncertainty in FCC is much higher. And again, this corresponds back to our Gibbs energies. And of course, we again can do this for any property. So here's the phase fractions. And so we can go through and pick a composition and then compute the step calculation of phase fraction versus temperature and see what the uncertainty looks like here. So again, we're seeing this transition temperature for the solidus is a lot more uncertain than the liquidus, where we're quite certain about where the liquid temperature is. And again, noticing this trend in this system, that the liquid has much less uncertainty than FCC. Okay, and so one key aspect of this work that I wanted to highlight is that we also are visualizing the uncertainty on the phase diagram. And so you can see how the phase boundaries, we basically just stacked them all on top of each other. And so you can see what the relative uncertainty of any phase boundary is just by how wide it is in the stacked region. And so, for example, we can see the width of the uncertainty in the liquid FCC phase boundary is a lot smaller than this copper 2 magnesium intermetallic phase. And so this work was doing this uncertainty quantification and visualization is part of the PDUC package, which you can use to get these type of plots in REPS PyCalFed as well. And this was led by Noah Paulson and Marius Stan at Argonne National Lab. So this work is also free and open source. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in these last few minutes here is sensitivity. And so this is some very recent work from this year where we've looked at this chrome nickel system, and we can look at using ESPEI, try to evaluate what the sensitivity is, so what the derivative of the likelihood is with respect to all of our parameters. And so we have several applications that we think are interesting in this paper. For example, you can look at particular CalFed type parameters. So we can look at the L0 interaction for the FCC A1 phase, for the A coefficient, for example, and we can look at the uncertainty for that and see that it has, and we can compute its sensitivity. And so we can see in this figure that the parameter with the highest sensitivity, as we get closer and closer to converge and have more iterations, is this this L1 for the FCC phase for the A. So this is the constant term. And so this has the most uncertain, or the most sensitivity. So what this plot is telling us is that changing this parameter a little bit is going to give us the most change in our likelihood. And so this is one example we can do with this sensitivity. Another one is that we can look at the data a different way, and we can say, okay, let's look at each individual data set now, and we can see which data sets have the most sensitivity in our Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation. And so in this case, we can see that this 1961 paper has the highest sensitivity. So what that's telling us is that um, when we're doing our MCMC simulation, this parameter is responsible for, or this set of data is responsible for a lot of the driving of the log probability. And so if we change the parameters a little bit from their values, we're going to see the biggest response in the likelihood, again, from data points in this data set. And so this is really interesting in being able to quantify, I don't want to say the impact of work, but quantify how informative a particular data set is on a particular model that you're using. Okay, and so again, just to remind you, and so to show as an example, we have this 1961 paper here, these circles, and so these circles are primarily on this FCC side. And so what it's saying is that changing your parameters is probably controlling these phase boundaries, and they are the most sensitive to changes in parameters. Is what that sensitivity is telling you. So really excited about the sensitivity work, and all the theory is laid out in that paper. But doing these kind of sensitivity analyses aren't yet mainlined into ESPEI, and so that's something that we're working on making more widely available. But if this is interesting to you and you're using ESPEI, definitely contact us, and we can point you in the right direction and help you to do the sensitivity analysis. Okay, and with that, I want to thank all the sponsors and organizers of this. So on behalf of the Materials Genome Foundation, thanks from us, and also thanks on behalf of the Max Planck Institute. And so with that, I know I'm a little bit over, but I can take any final questions on the MCMC or uncertainty quantification, and then we can wrap up after that. Okay. If there are no other questions, I'll go hand it off to Ziquei to go ahead and close this workshop.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Richard and Brandon, for this wonderful presentations. And I hope the people will start to use it. And if you have any question, you can go to the GitHub to leave your comments, and we'll try to answer your question. And if you want to develop new models for your applications, that we will help you to do that too. And we are going to build a big databases online for the use in terms of input data, like DFT data and the JSON format continuously. We are also building a MongoDB database to include all the input data for this kind of modeling. So if you want to contribute your data in the system, let us know. With that, I want to thank everybody. If you have any comments, questions, please let us know. Thank you.
I additionally wanted to make a comment. In case you found we're also interested, we'll send out a survey after the workshop and provide links to a lot of the material here. I additionally wanted to make a comment that we're interested in your feedback about the cloud infrastructure as well. And if you found this infrastructure interesting and useful, and you maybe have ideas for other events and other topics that you would find interesting, please get in touch with us. We'd like to